Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Nino Evgenidze, an Executive Director of Economic Policy Research Center. And we are very honored, privileged, and also, I don't know, we Georgians are blessed, you know, having friends like Frank Fukuyama, Kathryn Stoner, Roger Leeds, Eric Johnson, and all Stanford faculty, because, I mean, you know, they are friends for the good times and bad times, and we really appreciate the value, and we never forget the friends forever, who are the all-time friends, you know. Whenever they stand with us, whenever they fight together with us for freedom and democracy, and without any other, like, you know, the long speeches, I would like to give the floor to Professor Kathryn Stoner, Director of the Center for Democracy Development and Rule of Law, and she's going to be taking this floor from here to moderate the discussion, liberalism and its discontent. And thank you so much. It's going to be the conversation between the Francis Fukuyama and the Kathryn Stoner. Thank you so much for coming again.
Great. Thank you, Nino. Can you hear me okay, everyone? All right. Thank you, Nino, so much for having us. Thank you to the EPRC, to our wonderful staff at CDDRL who made this possible, and Nino's staff, and to colleagues here. And it's fun to see. I don't have my glasses on. I think I might have left them in the gym here at the hotel. But it's fun to see familiar faces, or at least I think they're familiar. And it's wonderful to be back in Georgia. It's such an incredibly beautiful country. Frank and I arrived this morning, so we haven't seen very much, but we've both been here before, of course. So you will know Francis Fukuyama as a friend to Georgia, a friend to democracy and development, author of, I'm not even sure how many books at this point, but probably over a dozen. And the most recent one is what we're here to talk about today, which is liberalism and its discontents. And I know there's some probably discontented liberals in the crowd, so this seems like a particularly apt moment to talk about this, given politics in Georgia, politics in the United States, in Europe, and of course the ongoing context of Russia's war on Ukraine. So, Frank, we decided to make this conversation style, and I apologize to you, it's going to be a kind of stilted conversation. We don't necessarily always sit next to each other like this. But I guess the best way to start this is to talk about what you mean by liberalism in this book, small L liberalism.
Okay, thank you, Kathryn, and thank you, Nino. It's really great to be back. I was last in Georgia, I believe, in 2019, and then COVID happened, and a war, and a lot of other things, but I'm really delighted to be able to be back in Tbilisi. They promised that they would feed me some really good Georgian food tonight, but I had to do this talk first in order to qualify to get it, so I'm really eager to get on to the real purpose of the trip, which is the eating. But I do think it's particularly important for all of us to be in Georgia at this particular moment, because liberalism and liberal democracy are really under very severe threat all over the world, and nowhere more than in this part of the world, particularly since February 24th of last year and the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So if I step back a little bit and define what I mean by liberalism, it has different meanings depending on what part of the world you're in. And I have a very broad and specific meaning that I attach to this word. In the United States, liberalism means that you're left of center. In Europe, if you say you're a liberal like the German Free Democrats, it means you're kind of right of center, you're pro-free market, more skeptical of the welfare state. I don't think that either of those are my definition. I believe liberals believe in the fundamental equal dignity of all human beings, regardless of where they live and where they come from and what their culture is. And you could oppose liberalism in that sense to certain forms of nationalism that want to privilege certain ethnic groups, races, peoples over others, or religiously organized societies that say that everybody has to belong to a particular confession or faith. I believe that liberals believe that there is this fundamental equal dignity that each of us has by virtue of the fact that we are human beings, and that that's the critical issue. And institutionally, what it means to be a liberal society means that you have a rule of law. You have a legal system and a constitution that protects the individual liberties of your citizens and restricts the power of governments to interfere in the lives of its citizens to the maximum extent possible, so that people are free to believe, to associate, to move, to make decisions, to own property, to have economic relations with one another. And if you have that kind of an institutional setup with this kind of independent judicial system, then I think you're a liberal country. You could have a big state like Sweden or Denmark, or you could have a relatively small state. It doesn't matter. What's critical is that rule of law and the protection of equal rights. And that's really, I think, at the core of what's being threatened around the world today, is that fundamental rule of law.
So can you say more about that? Where do you see those threats geographically and substantively? And when do you think those threats to liberalism and rule of law started?
Well, unfortunately, now you can see them everywhere. Freedom House every year publishes a Freedom in the World survey, and they just published one for 2022, and they now chart 17 years of consecutive decline of basically liberal democracy around the world. It peaked in about 2008 or 9, and it's been going down ever since. And it really takes two different forms. And so one form is the overt one that you see in this region. You now have Russia and China that are authoritarian countries. They don't make any pretenses really about being liberal democracies any longer. And they're behaving very aggressively, notably with the Ukraine invasion. And both of these countries have explicitly said that liberal democracy is in decline. Vladimir Putin in 2019 gave an interview to the Financial Times where he said, liberalism is an obsolete doctrine. It's going to be replaced by a stronger form of authoritarian government of the sort that they had in Russia. And China also is part of this campaign. They have argued that Western democracy is declining, it's in a terminal phase, and it's going to be replaced by a stronger form of government. Unfortunately, this threat is not just a geopolitical one, it's an internal one. And so you've seen the election of populist nationalist leaders in many countries. The list is a very familiar one, so you'd say Viktor Orban in Hungary, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, but unfortunately it also includes people like Donald Trump in the United States, who is now a candidate to be re-elected president, who is leading a populist movement that is illiberal. He doesn't put it in those terms, but the first thing he did when he was running for president was suggest that we should jail Hillary Clinton and, his political opponents, and he fomented an insurrection on January 6th in order to prevent the legal transfer of power after a free and fair election. And so it was a direct use of a democratic mandate to attack the liberal parts of liberal democracy. And that's been happening in a lot of other countries as well. You've had these terrible setbacks to what we hoped would be new democracies in Tunisia, in Myanmar, in El Salvador, many other places around the world. So you have both a geopolitical threat and a domestic populist nationalist threat.
Okay, so you talk about liberalism and then you talked about liberal democracy, and just so that everyone in the crowd is straight on this, all of the places you mentioned, Erdogan, Trump, Trump in the United States, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, technically they have elections, but you don't, can you say more about why those are not liberal
Sure.
Democracies, so we're all on the same page on that?
Right. So when we use the word democracy, democracy is often a shorthand for liberal democracy. A liberal democracy actually has two separate components. The liberal part of it has to do with the rule of law and these constraints on executive power, so that governments don't have the power to do anything they want. They're limited by law. The democratic part has to do with accountability, elections, the ability of voters to hold political leaders accountable, and you can have one without the other. And so Germany in the late 19th century was not a democracy, but it was a relatively liberal country. Some people would say that Singapore today is a very imperfect democracy, but it is a pretty strong rule of law country. And you can also have what unfortunately is now spreading in many parts of the world, illiberal democracy, where you have a leader who is legitimately elected and then uses that mandate to then dismantle the liberal part of liberal democracy. So what did Viktor Orban do when he was elected Prime Minister of Hungary? He began to dismantle the courts, the independence of the courts, the independence of the media. He then began to actually attack the democratic part of liberal democracy by gerrymandering electoral districts. So once you gain power by dismantling the liberal constraints on power, then you can go after the democratic institutions as well. And so there's a progression. But the first target of these illiberal populists is the liberal part of liberal democracy.
All right, thanks. So we generally, now I think especially in the United States, sometimes liberalism is equated with excessive wokeness and transgender rights. And why has liberalism become a bad word for some? Why is there this discontent? And is it among populations, or is it more among some of the leaders that you mentioned?
Yeah. Well, I have a general argument in the book that the problem with liberalism is not in the fundamental principles, that those principles remain, valid. The first liberal societies appeared over 300 years ago in Europe, and the justifications are the same, but the problem is that they've been taken too far. So what are the justifications for a liberal society? There's really three of them. One is just a pragmatic one. Liberalism was invented in Europe in order to overcome diversity in a population. At that time, it was religious diversity. After the Protestant Reformation, Protestants and Catholics spent the next 150 years killing one another in Europe's wars of religion, and at the end of this period, early liberal authors began to say, well, maybe we shouldn't build a society around a single religious idea because we need peace, we need to protect life itself, and not necessarily the good life as envisioned by a particular religious sect. And you can see the importance of something like that in India today. India had been founded in the 1940s as a liberal society, not like Pakistan that was based on one religion, but on the protection of religious diversity. And today, the Prime Minister and his party, the BJP, are trying to shift its identity back to one that's based on Hindu nationalism, which is a formula for endless conflict and violence because at least 200 million Indians are Muslim. They're not part of this Hindu majority. The other aspects of liberalism, there's a moral argument having to do with autonomy and the protection of human autonomy. That's the grounds on which we can regard ourselves as equal human beings because we all are capable of moral choice. And then finally, there's a very powerful economic argument in favor of liberalism because liberals protect property rights, and they protect the right to engage in commercial transactions, so that liberal societies have always been the richest societies in the world. And even China, so China today is by no means a liberal political system, but beginning in 1978 with Deng Xiaoping's reforms, he began to liberalize the Chinese economy, and everything they've accomplished since that point in terms of economic growth has to do with economic freedom, the fact that you have quasi-property rights in China, and that's actually what's now being rolled back by the current leader, Xi Jinping. So that's the basic justification for liberalism, but the excesses and the points where I think it has been misconstrued have to do with those basic principles. So in the economic sphere, we had this period that is labeled neoliberalism, where the basic ideas of a market economy were turned into a kind of religion, that markets were worshipped and the state was denigrated as an obstacle to economic growth. This is something that was associated with Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, University of Chicago, economists like Milton Friedman. They were right about a lot of this. I mean, a lot of their economic theorizing about the importance of property rights was absolutely correct, but they engaged in a political process of dismantling a lot of the regulation and controls that actually had stabilized the international system up until that point. And so, for example, the deregulation of financial markets, led directly to the 2008 subprime crisis in the United States. So that caused a backlash. You created a globalized world that was much more unequal because of these market forces than the one that had existed for most of the years after the Second World War. There are a lot of people left behind. They had their livelihoods outsourced to low labor cost countries, and I think a lot of the populism, both on the right and the left, resulted from that kind of inequality.
Is that just in the United States?
Well,
in
it
Europe,
was true
or
everywhere.
Here in Georgia? Or?
Yeah, so in Europe, they were always more favorable to state intervention than in the United States. But there was a lot of liberalization going on here as well. And again, I want to say a lot of this was useful. There was too much regulation, too much red tape in many sectors, but I do think that the single-minded focus on economic efficiency did create this global economy in which there was increasing levels of inequality. By the way, the two countries that participated in this the most enthusiastically were the US and Britain, right? These were the homes of this kind of economic neoliberalism, and they were the ones that were afflicted by these populist movements a decade or two later. All right, so that's on the more conservative side. On the more progressive liberal side, it really had to do with the idea of autonomy, that, most liberals believe that human beings have the capability of fundamental free will and ability to make choices, but for most people, what that moral ability means is to make a choice within an established moral framework that gives you some sense of community with other people. You have shared cultural traditions, shared beliefs, and that's the sphere in which you exercise autonomy. But with many liberals, they began to say, well, the greatest forms of autonomy are ones in which we get to make up the rules ourselves. And it became a movement that, opposed patriotism, opposed religious belief, sought to extend the realm of human freedom to areas where, a lot of people felt it was undermining the sense of community. So wokeness is, a label. You could say there's neoliberalism on the right-wing side coming from, economic conservatives, and then there's woke liberalism on the left side that became intolerant. You have a form of identity politics that appeared on the left that said that my identity based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation is essential, fundamental to who I am, and much more important than who I am as an individual, so that the first thing you want to judge about me is my skin color or my gender or whatever, and not what I've accomplished as an individual. And this form of progressive identity politics becomes illiberal because, as I said, liberalism fundamentally rests on the belief that human beings are individuals that need to be judged based on their individual characteristics, and we've been moving, towards a world in which you have group identities that are asserted. And by the way, if you don't believe that identity politics can be very problematic, look to a lot of countries in this neighborhood, Bosnia, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Libya. All of these countries are ones in which identities, whether sectarian, religious, ethnic, or whatnot, have completely undermined the possibility for any degree of national unity or feelings of, national solidarity, and it basically makes democratic politics not possible.
Right, right, and that's certainly something that Mr. Putin, for example, has used as a wedge issue even within Russian society, and something that he continues to sort of use as a weapon against the West as well. That even saying recently in a State of the Union address that pedophilia is legal in the United States. By the way, that's not true. It is not. So let's get more into who you think has become discontented then with liberalism, because you were getting to that at the end, which is you're sort of insinuating, and I know in the book you say a lot more about this, that it's sort of can be circular, right? You become so wrapped up in identity that you actually become intolerant of anyone who doesn't see identity as important. Is that what you think is creating discontent with liberalism among populations as opposed to just leaders?
Well, we need to disaggregate the different threats to liberalism. At the moment, the threat coming from the right, from authoritarians that are nationalist, religiously based, conservatives of that sort, is much more overt than the threat coming from the left. It involves the actual use of power, right? So Putin is using his army to get his way in Ukraine. In the United States, in red states where Republicans have controlled the state legislature, they're trying to do things like use law to dictate what professors can say and can't say in state universities, to prohibit certain kinds of discussions of American history and so forth. And so that's a pretty overt threat to liberal institutions. But there's a threat that comes from the left as well, which is more cultural in nature, that has to do with, shouting down people that express conservative views, trying to get them fired from elite institutions. And so we've had quite a number of instances of this kind of illiberal behavior. I would say between the two of these, the much more immediate and powerful threat is really the right-wing one. But the left-wing one exists also, and I would say that among my students, students that are in their 20s and 30s, a lot of them have been brought up in a period where they regard my form of liberalism, this belief in kind of the universality of human dignity, is kind of an old-fashioned belief, and that things like commitment to freedom of speech are something that my generation, me meaning someone old, believes in, but they don't necessarily take as a foundation of their values and principles.
So it's interesting that it's come to this, of course, because over the last, we've had several wars fought over identity, and in multicultural empires fall apart, and here we are back again. So is this a new old problem, or is it in geopolitics, do you think, or is it a fundamentally different problem?
Well, it's an old problem. The whole history of the two world wars were all about assertions of a certain kind of aggressive national identity. But this is an important issue to get right, because I also believe that national identity is important for liberal democracy, that you actually need a certain sense of national identity in order to maintain a democratic country, because basically if you don't believe that you are living in the same political space as your fellow citizens, you're not going to have a country. You know, you're going to have Lebanon or Bosnia or, you know, some other kind of country that can't really agree on an overall framework by which people can live together. So how do you square this circle? This is actually one of the most difficult issues. How do you maintain national identity and yet maintain liberal values? And I think the way you do it is that you need to build identity around liberal principles, that it's actually the freedom, the rule of law, the constitutional order that should be at the basis of your patriotism and why, you know, you prefer to live in your country. So we're talking about this in very abstract terms, but let's just think about it in terms of what's going on in Ukraine right now. Why are Ukrainians fighting and dying in this war in such great numbers, and why are they showing the degree of heroism? Is it because they're simply fighting for their sovereignty and their, you know, independence, or are they actually fighting for their freedom? And, you know, having spent a lot of time in Ukraine and having lots of Ukrainian friends, I would say that you can't distinguish between these two things. Nobody fights for freedom, or I would say very few people are actually willing to die just for the abstract idea of freedom. You know, somebody is losing their freedom in a country that's 6,000 miles away from you. Your willingness to go die on their behalf is going to be pretty limited, and actually it's probably a good thing that it's a little bit limited, because you don't want people marching off and dying for, you know, by interfering in the systems of other countries. We do die, on the other hand, for our country, because you have a certain belief in, you know, your own people, and you are, I think, naturally filled with emotions of solidarity towards people that are closer to you. But what is it that binds a people together? I think that it actually has to be based on fundamentally liberal principles, which are inclusive of everybody in the country. So you take Ukraine, one of the constituent, you know, ethnicities in Ukraine are Crimean Tatars. We know a lot of them very well because they have been a persecuted minority in the former Soviet Union, and they are persecuted today once the Russians retook Crimea. I mean, it's terrible what's happened to this people, but although Ukrainians who are Orthodox and ethnically Ukrainian have their own traditions, they respect the traditions of the Crimean Tatars, and they have preserved, while they were sovereign over Crimea, they were protecting that freedom. And I actually, you know, it's very impressive. One of our good friends is Mustafa Naim, who was really the one that set off the whole Maidan revolution, right? He was the journalist that...
2014.
Yeah, in 2014, he was the one that sent out the Facebook post suggesting that everybody go to Maidan to protest the turn of the previous government towards Russia. And he was born in Afghanistan, right? He came as a child to Ukraine, and, you know, he's completely accepted as Ukrainian because I think the modern liberal understanding of Ukrainian national identity does not exclude people that are not Orthodox, that are not white or European. You know, it's basically a deeper set of liberal values that are critical. And I think that that is the kind of identity that is necessary in a multi-ethnic society. You know, this is a part of the world where ethnic identity is, you know, runs very strong. It's something the Russians have played on in your country and in other places around the world. And so it's important both to maintain a sense of overall national identity, but one based on liberal principles that actually is inclusive of the actual diversity of the people that live in your society. And by the way, so Russia has a big problem with this, right? Because Putin would sort of like to say that Russian identity is built around orthodoxy and Russian language.
He would
but
even like to say it. He did say it. He wrote
Yeah.
it down. He said,
yes, right.
apparently a student of a certain kind of history.
But
Yep.
he's got a lot of people that are not Orthodox and not Russian
Right.
living in the
Yes,
Russian
the
Federation.
Muslim issue
Yeah.
there. Yep. Yeah, and actually, you know, when you think about the Ukraine war, he's using identity politics very much, right? It's that he's but wants to impose a certain identity on Ukrainians, which is one that is like Russians, right? And so his essay in June of 2021 was entitled "The Unity of Russian and Ukrainian People." So clearly trying to use identity politics, but in a different way, not as inclusive kind of liberalism. I want to hear you talk more about the Ukraine war, but I know people in the crowd probably also want to hear you talk about Georgia and how this might apply to Georgia. And I know that you and Nino co-authored a piece recently in Foreign Affairs saying that Russia was winning more or less here. Can you talk a little bit about that and where you see this applying here? And then I guess we can turn to the audience for questions. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so first of all, with this audience, I don't think I need to tell you anything about the influence of Russia in Georgia. I think you are all perfectly aware of that. And I think that what's important is for people outside of Georgia to recognize the fact that your politics is very imperfectly democratic. That is to say, you hold elections, but they are ones that can be manipulated by money and by various forms of influence. And the agenda that is actually pursued by the government is not necessarily the one that is publicly articulated, because, you know, the influence of Russia here is strong and is getting stronger by the day. And so it's very important for people outside of Georgia to recognize this. I think, you know, so we've all been extremely involved with Ukraine. We have run a lot of programs with Ukrainians, and the whole world's attention ever since February 24th of 2022 has been focused on Ukraine, but it's also meant that we've not paid sufficient attention to a lot of other countries around Russia's periphery, including your country. And so I think it's very important, you know, what I think Nino and I were trying to argue in that article is that, you know, the current government would actually like to derail Georgia's European future. You know, they don't want that kind of alignment of Georgia and Europe, and they've been doing things to prevent that from happening that will get the Europeans to say, no, we can't take Georgia in. And I think that that would be a mistake because, as I understand it, the vast bulk of Georgians actually want a European future. And, you know, you can't let this derailment happen. And therefore, if you're going to sanction people, you should sanction that part of Georgia and the Georgian society that is actually responsible for preventing the European future and the European identity of Georgia. And that has implications for, you know, Western sanctions policy and the way that the West regards this country. Georgia needs Western support and help as a liberal democracy, not as a kind of quiet and hidden ally of Russia. So that was basically, that's a point, but I don't think, like I said, that I need to explain any of this to anybody in this audience.
Great, thanks. So, Nina, we're having... Are they, are people supposed to, okay, so there are traveling mics apparently. So if you have a question, just put your hand up clearly. I see Gia in the front here, right there. Gia Nodia, yep. There he is, standing up. See, he's in the second row, yep. Waving.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I enjoyed reading your book, Frank, so I would love to ask several questions, but I will limit myself to one, but a little bit kind of theoretical maybe. Okay, I was inspired by a quotation which I read recently. I don't remember the author, a British author who said that about British liberals of classical era liberalism, that they could atomize British society because the British society was not atomized at all. It had very strong bond of patriotism. What I am hinting at is that liberalism, according to quite a few people, is partly parasitic, if you wish, or depends on certain values, beliefs, commitments that do not come from actual classical liberal thinkers like patriotism or like maybe some religious beliefs. And this belief in universal human dignity also may have somewhat earlier roots than classical liberalism. So, but it wasn't produced by or formulated by John Locke or Adam Smith or Immanuel Kant and thinkers like that. So, and do you think that this kind of crisis of liberalism or kind of attacks on liberalism also are linked to those pre-liberal foundations of liberalism being also kind of weakened?
Yes, so that's a really good question, which I would expect from you, Gia. So it is true that you actually, it's very difficult to found a liberal society using only liberal techniques, right? And the existing liberal nations in Europe, for example, like Germany, France, Britain, were all created in pre-liberal periods, and most of them were created with a lot of violence, right? The English were always at war with Scotland or with Wales or the Irish, up until the early 20th century. France was divided, linguistically in multiple ways. Germany wasn't even a country until the 1871, and so forth. And that creation of today's modern nations was not done by liberal means. It was done by a lot of violence, ethnic cleansing, conquest, forcible redrawing of borders. And so, in a sense, the current liberal societies are the fortunate heirs of non-liberal pasts where these nation states were delivered to them, as a whole, and they can build a democracy on top of those. So that is correct. It's also the case that there are certain cultural foundations. The sense of a national community is something that usually isn't driven in the first place just by liberal principles. Liberals, because they believe in tolerance and they believe in protecting diversity, and so your sense of community is never as unified or as strong as in a society that has a single religion, a single ethnicity, a single dominant national narrative. And that means that there are certain countries that have proclivities towards more or less liberal institutions. Something like civil society, for example. It's not true that liberal societies are necessarily alienated and isolated, where you just have individuals guarding their privacy with no community. Most liberal societies actually have very strong civil society and the ability to associate. But where does that come from? It comes from a lot of different sources that are probably not liberal in origin. So this is a long-winded answer to your question, saying yes, there are other conditions historically that have made liberal societies possible. But if you live in a society that has inherited those conditions, you should be glad and you should make use of them, right? And that's the way that liberalism, I think, ultimately will succeed.
Okay, another question here. I'm not sure where the microphones are, but you see in the front there. Great.
Good evening. Thank you, Frank. Great comments, enjoyed a lot. And my question is related to the ongoing processes that we are witnessing since Russia invaded the Ukraine. And one of the characteristics of this information war is the informational leaks. Like we have leaks from Russia, we have leaks from Western intelligence institutions. So the information that has been leaked from Russia shows that, for example, Russia is trying to, was trying, how successful, that's a different issue, but was trying to create a, let's say in Germany, horseshoe coalition against the mainstream politics of engaging and supporting and against liberalism in general. On the other hand, we see leaks from the Western countries, and we don't see in those leaks that anybody is thinking on that type of strategic engagement with the countries or with the geographic areas where West has its inherent interest in terms of promoting liberalism, and it is kind of a left as a prey for the Russian aggressive politics. So is anybody thinking in the West how to counter this type of strategic thinking of Russia?
Well, it's a dilemma for a liberal society because you don't want to turn yourself into a version of your enemy, you know, an illiberal society. So, for example, although the United States tries to use positive information, you know, in a kind of war, a propaganda war against Russia, is the United States going to deliberately inject false information, you know, into the Russian media system? You know, I think we've tended not to do that. Actually, Kathryn can speak more to the question about whether it would make sense to, for example, have the United States or Europe play on ethnic divisions within Russia, because that's, you know, that's, I think that's probably what you were getting at, but maybe you want to.
So, I mean, I don't know that we have a ton of leverage on that, to be honest. So, you know, we have the Chechens, well, not the Chechens, but one Chechen with his little tribe around him, Kadyrov, obviously fighting in Ukraine on Russia's behalf. But you know, there's not a lot of ethnic discontent per se in Russia itself. So this is, I think, not a particularly fruitful thing for the United States to go after. But there could be, tomorrow I'm going to give a talk in our program here on governing incompetence within Russia itself, and I think that's really the button to push as opposed to ethnic divisions. Even though there are 121 different ethnicities within Russia, there's not really a lot of kind of collective action in that respect. But there is some mild growing discontent with you know, the ability to actually govern and provide goods and services in Russia, especially given how much money is having to go into the war effort. So that's probably a better button to try to push. But I should also say, we've lost tremendous, and this is related to what you have said, Frank, and gets to this question is, you know, I think the United States, and I say this as a Canadian-American citizen, I'm both, has lost, and this began even before Donald Trump, leadership position in the world, or even as an example of you know, democracy and liberal democracy in particular. And I think this is very, you know, this has been problematic, and some European countries have begun to teeter as well. So I think we have to look also at what has happened to large liberal democracies that 20, 30 years ago were thought to be sort of shining lanterns on the hill and are not so much anymore. That's also very problematic, and that's a lot of what this book is about too.
Yeah. Also, I would say that there's a fundamental asymmetry. So you may have been following this story of Tucker Carlson. So he's the single most popular, you know, talking head on Fox News, right? And he has been a Russian mouthpiece. Right? We recently had this problem with these leaks in which apparently the Russians themselves doctored the documents to show that Ukrainian casualties were higher than Russian casualties. So Tucker Carlson picks this up and tells his audience of 3 million people, see, your government's lying to you, the Russians are actually winning this war, we should stop supporting Ukraine, you know, and so forth. So he is acting like a Russian agent. Now, he lost his job on Fox News a couple days ago, but what would happen if the shoe were on the other foot and there was an equivalent of, well, there wouldn't be the equivalent of Tucker Carlson on RT or, you know, on a Russian media channel, but supposing the United States government said, okay, we're going to go all in to support Alexei Navalny, and we're going to publicize everything he says and throw our diplomatic weight behind him, what would happen, right? The Russians would just lock him up even further. I mean, it's not really a point of leverage. I would like to lock up Tucker Carlson, you know, I really do think he's a Russian agent, but he's going to go on free because we are living in a liberal democracy, and, you know, you can't do anything about somebody like him that is actually spreading propaganda for the other side because we are a liberal society. So we do have these constraints that we operate under in this propaganda war.
Yeah, well, you can always turn your television off,
Yes,
right? Which you
well,
have done. I know you don't watch TV. So, but actually, I wanted, as we think, it's if looking around for other questions, I think there's some, we should try and send you all the way up the stairs. No, here she comes. I'm hoping one of the questions we'll get to, what is the way back from this
How
problem?
far have you come since you wrote your book, The End of History, which was very optimistic in those heady days since the collapse of the Soviet Union?
So the
You can never escape that book, Frank. Fundamentally misunderstood book.
Well, you know, if the question is, does the global situation for democracy look worse today than it did in 1991? The answer is obviously yes. I mean, it would be foolish to deny that we've had all of these setbacks, but, you know, the book was really more about the long-term trajectory of the development process and what kind of society would emerge as societies became more modern, you know, made use of more technology, grew richer, and so forth. Would they look like a liberal democracy, or is there some alternative form of socio-political organization that will transcend democracy? Now, in the days when you had real Marxist believers, the Marxists said, yes, that society is a communist society. There is a higher form of social organization that's out there. We haven't gotten there yet, but we will eventually. And, you know, the question that I was trying to stimulate was, is there a higher form of social organization than liberal democracy linked to a market economy? And I think the answer is still no. I don't think Russia represents a higher form of organization. China has a more plausible case to make for itself because it is successful economically, technologically, but do I expect the world to look more like China in 50 years? I have my doubts whether that itself is a sustainable system. Is it going to look like Saudi Arabia, Iran, some kind of theocracy? I don't think that's going to be the case either. So in terms of the overall trajectory of where a modern society, you know, is going to end up, I still don't see much of a realistic alternative to liberal democracy. And so that core part of the hypothesis is something that I still believe in.
Yeah, there are not a lot of people walking around saying, we want autocracy, right? Might be willing to accept autocracy because you feel apathetic, but not because it is a much better alternative.
And by the way, you know, the way I look at it, you can tell what's a popular political system by where do people leaving poor, disorganized, corrupt societies, where do they flee to? Do they flee to China? Do they go to Russia? Do they go to Venezuela? Do they go to Iran? No, they go to Europe, they go to the United States, they go to Canada.
They go to Georgia.
And they go to, yeah, well, few too many of them go to Georgia, but.
All right, another question. I see one over here. I'm not sure where our roving microphones are, but. Oh, okay, up there, sorry.
Hi again, Frank. Thank you. Kathryn from OSGF. So, did I understand correctly that in addition to lots of threats coming to liberalism, you see as one of the major factors of backlash towards liberalism, the neoliberal ideology and politics? And what can we be thinking about, like going back to classical liberalism in order to save the whole liberal idea in the world? Or are you thinking of any other ways? How can we all overcome?
Well, if the problem is the inequality that's created by neoliberalism, I actually think there's a pretty simple solution to that, which is to go back to the kind of social democracy that I think was the winning formula in Europe and in the United States for much of the period after World War II. That is to say, liberalism by itself is not sufficient. If you only have liberalism, you tend to create increasingly unequal societies. And that needs to be moderated by a state that does a certain degree of redistribution. It provides health care, it provides social services for people that are not doing as well in that market competition. And that was a formula that worked in Europe and it worked in the United States pretty well. The main problem was sustainability, because a lot of these societies were spending too much on social security, and therefore they had to make adjustments like the one that Macron is trying to do in France right now. But I think that that is fundamentally the solution. The state actually has a role to play in equalizing economic outcomes. And that actually is, it's easier to see how you fix that problem than how you fix, for example, the identity problem that comes up on the other side of the political spectrum.
Interesting. Yep.
Hello. Hi, Mike Honigstein. I'm the political and economic counselor at the U.S. Embassy here in Tbilisi. I sort of feel like I have to give a little bit of defense of the liberal world order, considering the U.S. spent a lot of time and effort helping to set it up. I do believe, as you said before, that liberal democracy does win out. I think that one of the mistakes that we made in promoting liberal democracy is that I would define liberalism as that each person can live in dignity. And what I found, as 20 years as a diplomat, is that in different cultures, dignity is defined in different ways. And as we started to promote liberal democracies, we started to promote dignity as if it meant the same thing to the Americans. I would say that this is one of our huge problems in Russia, because in Russia, what I have learned is that within the Russian culture, a dignified existence means an existence in a country that is seen as a superpower. And this is part of Putin's contract with the Russian people, that he can oppress them, that he can suppress their human rights in ways that we in the US would not consider a dignified existence. But as long as he's making Russia look strong to the world, that's dignity. And to bring that to Georgia, I actually believe that Georgians have a very similar view of dignity actually to the United States. When we in our official communications talk about shared values, that's not just a tagline. I think the rugged mountain culture of Georgia sort of has, similar to the sort of rugged pioneer culture that developed in the United States of individualism. And so I do think that that's a way forward that, but what happens is that once liberal democracy proved it's the best, if you look at sort of classic propaganda, what you do is you don't oppose it, you try to define it in a way that is convenient to you. So neoliberalism probably isn't real liberalism, but they were trying to define it so that they could associate with the accepted liberal democracy. And I think we see that in Georgia as well going on now, that people are trying to redefine what are well-established Georgian values in a way that is convenient to serve people who are not liberal.
Frank?
Well, I think one of the big questions is whether there is a kind of universal belief and desire for freedom as Americans understand it and as you're saying Georgians understand it. And I would say that if you look at this thing in a long-term historical perspective, it's hard to argue, like George W. Bush did, that the desire for freedom is universal. Everybody basically wants the same thing, because even in the West, even in Europe, you roll the clock back 300 years, you didn't have this desire for individual liberty. That was something that developed historically over time. There is a theory that says that as your society becomes richer, better educated, when people begin to own more property, they develop an interest in protecting, their sphere of liberty. They take certain values more seriously. The ability to criticize, to think for themselves becomes much stronger as the overall level of education of the society increases. And I think if you're going to defend universal values, you have to put it in that kind of historical context where not every country in every part of the world, wants the American, Georgian, whatever version, but it does, in a certain sense, depend on a social development that is a more universal kind of process. So in East Asia, for example, Japan, Korea, Taiwan have actually become much more individualistic, more American-like democracy. I mean, anybody that's familiar with those countries knows that they're very different from the United States in terms of this, trade-off between collective and individual values, but they have come a long way in terms of accepting a more individualistic understanding of their societies, and they've done that because they've actually turned into developed first world, technological great powers that innovate, that have very modern economies and super educated populations. And so I think that's really the issue, whether over historical time with development you don't get more of a convergence in values. That's what we were hoping would happen with China. It didn't so far materialize, but that does not mean that that's not ultimately going to be something that will happen in that society over time as well.
Do you see China as offering an alternative model globally, or that any countries are taking up that model globally? And then I see there's another question here in the front row.
I think that the Chinese definitely believe they have their own model. Unlike the Marxist model, they, I think, tend not to think that it's exportable, because they understand that they have this deep cultural tradition of meritocracy, bureaucracy, respect for education, for literacy, and so forth, and not other countries necessarily have that. And so they have a lot of pride in their own history and their own system. They basically say everybody should govern themselves the way they want to, whether it's authoritarian or democratic. And I don't think that they believe that everybody's going to look like China, because I actually think that they kind of think nobody's as good as we are, so they're just never going to get to our level.
Interesting. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
It's great to have you back. Wonderful to see you. And my question is about security. And something I think we hear in Tbilisi, you talked about Ukraine. We all feel that the liberalism has its price to pay. And having a neighbor, Russia, wherever he sees there's a liberalism or more demand for freedom, when it was Hungary in 50s, or Czechoslovakia in 68, or Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014 or 2020. It just goes and crushes it, sends tanks. And now we're having a war over democracy, liberalism. And West is involved, helping Ukraine to defend its liberalism, democracy. But Georgia is very vulnerable in this case as well. And you talked about, and you wrote a wonderful piece with Nino about this Russian influence, and the same, this government is trying to spread this word that, the war, and be afraid of that. I think there's a component that I would like to hear your view on it. How can we integrate this kind of ideas of liberalism, democracy that should come with the security and it needs to be defended, as Ukraine showed. Is any thinking that you think is developing in the West through NATO or through European or American political thinking that this comes together? We do not have this luxury, just have liberalism and democracy developing without security and defense arrangements for countries like Ukraine, Georgia, or Baltic states or former Eastern.
Look, I think that change is happening. The whole German Zeitenwende is a recognition that the world is different after the Ukrainian invasion. And the trouble is it's a slow change. You're overthrowing 40 years of German foreign policy, and you still have a lot of people that are pacifists that really don't like, the idea of investing in a big military, but it's happening. It has to happen. The Japanese were in a similar position from Germany. After the Ukraine invasion, they announced that they're going to double their defense spending, which had been at 1%, it's going to go up to 2%. And so it's a change that I think everybody recognizes. One of the things that's come out of the Ukraine war is NATO is stronger than it was before the war started. If you remember back a few years ago, Emmanuel Macron said that NATO was brain dead. I don't think anybody would, even him, would not argue that NATO is brain dead, right now. And so I do think that we all have to have a change in our attitudes about the importance of security. We can't live in the modern world without it. But you also have to recognize it takes time to bring everybody along on this journey.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. There's one right behind you there, Nino. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to expand on the previous question. So would you agree that still there are some inherent weaknesses of liberalism in defending itself? So some would argue that if liberalism is very cautious on the methods to fight back its adversaries, it may weaken it. I was just reading back years ago, actually, in Stanford University, that liberalism is fighting with its adversaries with one hand, another hand is tied to its back. If it wants to fight with two hands and full-fledged, it has to be not liberal. Would you agree? Is there a dilemma?
No, I don't. Well, there's a dilemma, but I don't agree that a liberal society needs to become illiberal simply to fight against its enemies. If the fight is basically over liberal values and you give up your liberal values, what's the point of fighting, right? Now, it is true that many liberal societies compromised certain liberal values in a larger struggle. And so in the United States, actually Japanese Americans were incarcerated, including members of my family during World War II when the US was fighting Japan. Abraham Lincoln famously suspended habeas corpus, this protection against arbitrary arrest during the Civil War. Ukraine has basically, unified the whole Ukrainian media under a kind of state-controlled apparatus that doesn't have the diversity that it did before the war started. So yes, liberal societies oftentimes do have to compromise their principles, but if they compromise them too far, then they lose the whole point of the fight, right? If you're going to become just like your enemy, then, what's the struggle about? And so it is a dilemma. There's no easy answer, but I do think that liberal societies over time have shown that they can actually wage these big geopolitical struggles and yet remain meaningfully liberal.
So I think we're almost finished our time's almost up, right? But I guess a number of us are still kind of hitting on this question about that you linked it to security, liberalism and security. What to do with the discontent? And how far do you see it penetrating societies as much as a perspective is being pushed on people through social media, through different messaging in this part of the world, coming in particular from Russia? that liberalism is dead, that you know all we care about in liberal democratic countries are trans rights and things like that. What's the solution to that, Frank? Because I know you do also a lot of work on the internet and social media, and what you know can Georgia do? What can the United States do in the face of this, given that we are more liberal societies?
Well, there's no easy answer. Like, so one thing, you know, that has to happen is Ukraine has to win this war. I mean, they basically have to win the war, and they really need to do it within the next 6 to 9 months. And I think they will. I mean, nobody asked me for my opinion about the military situation in southern Ukraine. I have a lot of opinions about that, but I do think they will win it. So that in this region is extremely important, and therefore the support that's being given Ukraine is also very important. In democratic societies like the United States, I think we need to get our act together, and we need to win elections. You know, we need to make sure that populists do not come to power. And so that is a matter of mobilizing people, you know, communicating, and it also means reaching out to people that are attracted to populism, because many of the things that populists say and want are not crazy. You know, there is a lack of respect that oftentimes educated, more liberal people, attitudes that they have towards people that are not like themselves, that are not very tolerant, and that breeds a lot of resentment on the part of people, working class people, people that live in rural areas, you know, that don't live in big cities and so forth. I think we have to be aware of that and learn to speak to people that are different from us. The internet, that's a whole, we're going to have a whole nother conference on that one, because there's not a clear solution to how disinformation and the lack of trust that has been created by the internet is something that we can actually deal with in a liberal society. And unfortunately, that may get worse before it gets better, because you now have all of these deep fakes that are being produced by artificial intelligence that are about to be unleashed in the world. And in terms of the general level of distrust that people have for institutions, that's going to make things worse. But that's a discussion for another evening.
So you have to come back again to Georgia.
Of course.
I think that's the end of the evening. Nino, did you
If I
have
may
anything to
add
say?
some, some acknowledgements, because Economic Policy Research Center, together with the Fukuyama Democracy Frontline Center, which was established 5 years ago with support of the Ajara Group, and I would like to express my gratitude to Ajara Group hosting this event and also having this great center here in Stamba Hotel, which helps the freedom fighters all around the world, and especially from the frontline states like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Russia, Armenia, and some many other countries. And we have this publishing like a house, and translating the the world well-known books. And the latest one is the Liberalism and its Discontent. Now it's available in Georgian language again. And we previously translated the Frank's Identity a few years ago, and we were one of the first foreign language translation of this. And I would like to also mention, not to mention, but expressing our gratitude again to the Open Society Georgia Foundation, and Kathy is somewhere there, because you know that when the space for democracy is shrinking, sometimes the partners are disappearing, you know, and thank you, Kathy, because you are always there. Thanks a lot. I want to thank you, the U.S. Embassy, because they are, without their support and without their, the engagement, we cannot do anything else. I would like our private sector, TBC Bank, and the ARKI Group, and all Ajara Group, and also USAID UNOC program, which supported this initiatives. Your visit here, and also, as you are aware, we have the Leadership Academy for Development together with the Stanford University, and we have 150 fellows now in Georgia, and we are very proud of our alumni. because we believe that the fight for freedom and democracy, it's a common fight together with our Ukrainian and other freedom fighters. And all these alumni are kind of like a main driver for this fight. And we strongly believe, and with your mentorship and with support of the Stanford University, we're not going to give up. And we will win. And Ukraine will win. And Slava Ukraini. Thank you so much.
Slava Geroy. Thank you all very much.